Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a version of American history based on our source materials that might just challenge everything you think you know. It's a story that puts forward a powerful idea that the very first Americans were black.
So let's just start with this one question, because it really reframes the entire conversation. We're asked to consider, what if the story of Black America doesn't begin with chains in the belly of a ship, but with roots that were already planted deep, deep in American soil?
All right, here's how we're going to break this down. We'll look at the contested history, touch on the conventional story we all know, then dive into the evidence that challenges it. After that, we'll explore this concept of a paper genocide, and finally, what it all means for the idea of a stolen legacy.
You know, America's origin story isn't some settled, dusty old book. It's an active battleground. On one side, you've got the standard academic view. But on the other, there's this powerful counter-narrative that argues the story we've been told isn't just missing a few pages, it's been deliberately rewritten. So, before we get into the challenge, let's do a quick refresh on the official story. This is the timeline that you'll find in most history textbooks, the one that's pretty much the foundation of what we're taught in school.
You've probably heard this a million times, right? It kicks off about 15,000 years ago, with people migrating across the Bering Land Bridge. Then we jump forward to 1492. Europeans arrive, bringing diseases that just decimate native populations. This, in turn, creates a massive labor shortage, which gets filled by the transatlantic slave trade, and that's presented as the origin point for almost all black people in the United States.
And to power that colonial economy, we're talking sugar, tobacco, cotton, Europeans initiated the largest forced migration in human history. The number that's generally accepted is just staggering. Somewhere around 10 million enslaved Africans were brought to the Americas.
Okay, but now let's look at the other side of the coin. Our sources lay out a case that directly challenges that entire timeline. They use historical documents, archaeology, and a hard look at the numbers to argue for a very, very different past.
And this is the absolute core of the argument, that dark-skinned or melanated people are indigenous to the Americas, what many call Turtle Island. And not just for a few centuries, the claim is that they've been here for eons, predating every other known migration to the continent. This point of view completely recontextualizes the American landscape itself. Think about it. Structures that are often just called mounds, like the ones at Cahokia, are presented here as massive pyramid complexes, centerpieces of huge, complex civilizations. The argument is that this is clear evidence of a highly advanced society that existed long, long before Columbus ever set sail.
And the argument points right to the words of the early Europeans themselves. According to the sources, Spanish conquistadors back in the 1500s made a really critical distinction. They wrote about the local dark-skinned people, calling them negros de terras, which means blacks of this land. But they used a different term for imported African slaves, negros de Guinea. The implication is pretty obvious. They were talking about two completely different groups of people.
And this just adds another layer to that evidence. Verrazano's account is cited as just one of several from the 1500s, where European explorers specifically documented encounters with what they called Black Indians or Negro Indians all along the Gulf and Atlantic coasts, and this was way before the transatlantic slave trade really ramped up.
You know, this counter-narrative isn't just based on written accounts. The sources also point to visual proof from the time, like this piece of German church art. Here, the entire continent of America is personified as a melanated figure. This suggests that back in the 17th century European mindset, the original American was understood to be dark-skinned.
All right, now we get to the numbers. And this is where the argument gets really, really provocative. Even mainstream historians agree that out of all the millions taken from Africa, a relatively small number, less than 500,000, maybe around 400,000, were brought directly to the territory that would become the U.S.
Now, put that number up against today's population of over 45 million black Americans. The sources basically ask, how is that possible? How could a starting population of under 500,000 grow that much, especially when they were living under the unbelievably brutal, life-shortening conditions of slavery? The argument is that, statistically, it just doesn't add up. It's a demographic near impossibility.
So if that population growth wasn't exclusively from natural reproduction, this huge discrepancy begs the question, how did it happen? Well, the answer this narrative proposes is that the numbers were massively inflated by simply reclassifying huge numbers of indigenous people on paper, labeling them as slaves.
And that leads us to this central, chilling concept, a deliberate, calculated erasure of identity, not carried out with guns or swords, but with something way more subtle and, in some ways, more permanent:
paperwork. Our sources call it a paper genocide.
So what does that mean? The sources define paper genocide as a conscious, systematic campaign by colonial powers and later the US government to literally change who people were on paper. And the goal, they argue, wasn't just about neat categorization. It was about raw political and economic gain.
And you can trace this process through actual laws. It starts way back in 1705 with colonial codes that just lump indigenous people and Africans into the same category. Then it continues with acts in the late 1800s designed to dismantle tribal lands, and it all kind of culminates in laws like the 1924 Racial Integrity Act, which, with just the stroke of a pen, could legally erase a person's entire heritage.
A really famous example that's cited is the landmark civil rights case Loving Virginia. History remembers Mildred Jeter as a black woman, but our sources point out that she and her family actually identified as Virginia Indian. But because of Virginia's Racial Integrity Act, her indigenous identity was officially erased, and on paper, she was reclassified as colored.
So you have to ask, why? What was the real motivation behind this massive systematic reclassification? Well, according to the sources, it all boils down to three things: land, wealth, and power.
The sources argue this was a brutally effective strategy. Think about it. By changing someone's identity on a census form from Indian to Negro, you could instantly nullify their treaty rights. You could disenfranchise them. And you could open the door for the seizure of vast amounts of land and all the generational wealth that came with it.
The collapse of the Freedmen's Bank is presented as a perfect example of this wealth extraction. By reclassifying indigenous people as newly freed slaves, they were funneled into systems just like this bank. So when it failed, thanks to gross mismanagement by its white administrators, the very first generation of savings for this newly defined black community was just gone, wiped out. A massive theft of generational wealth.
So, in the end, this explainer really highlights a fundamental idea presented in our sources, that history isn't just a set of facts carved in stone. It's a living, breathing, contested space, a battleground of narratives. And that leaves us all with a really crucial question to think about. As new evidence and different perspectives keep coming to light, who gets to write the final chapter?